The glass rattled sharply as the man's knuckles struck the table, the sound slicing through the soft jazz and low chatter of the restaurant like a crack in polished marble. "Hey, are you invisible or just slow?" Richard Coleman didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. The authority in it carried, cold and precise, turning heads without effort. Ava Johnson had already been walking toward the table, a tray balanced steadily in her hands, but she stopped half a step away, the weight of his tone landing before she even set the drinks down. The overhead lights cast a warm amber glow across the white tablecloth, catching the edge of the silverware, the condensation sliding down a glass of iced water, but none of it softened the way he looked past her, not at her, as if she were just another object in the room that hadn't moved fast enough. "I've been sitting here for 5 minutes," he continued, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, eyes flicking briefly over her uniform before dismissing her again. "If I wanted to be ignored, I'd stay home." Ava lowered the tray carefully, placing each glass with quiet precision, her movements practiced, controlled, the kind that came from years of knowing that any mistake, any reaction, would be remembered longer than it should. "I'm sorry for the wait, sir," she said gently, her voice steady, warm, even as the tension in the air tightened like a drawn wire. But he didn't respond to her apology. Instead, he reached for his phone, already disengaged, already done with her, as if the conversation had never existed. Across from him, a small boy sat in silence, feet not quite touching the floor, his fingers curled loosely around the edge of the table. He hadn't looked up when his father slammed his hand down. He hadn't flinched. He just stared at the reflection of the overhead light in his glass, unmoving, distant, like the world around him had been turned down to a low hum. Ava noticed him immediately. She always noticed the quiet ones. There was something in the stillness of his shoulders, the way he held his breath just a second too long, that pulled at something deep and unspoken inside her chest. But before she could say anything, before she could even offer a small smile, Richard's voice cut back in, sharper now, impatient. "And don't hover. Just bring the food when it's ready." The words weren't loud, but they landed harder than if they had been. A few tables nearby fell silent, eyes dropping quickly back to their plates, pretending not to watch. Ava straightened slightly, hands folding together for a brief second before she stepped back, giving him exactly the distance he demanded, even if it meant erasing herself from the space entirely. The boy didn't move. The ice in his glass shifted softly with a faint clink, the only sound at the table now. For a moment, Ava hesitated, not long enough to be noticed, but long enough to feel it, the quiet pull to stay, to say something, to break through that silence. But she turned, as she always did, carrying the weight of unspoken things back toward the kitchen, the hum of the restaurant rising again behind her like nothing had happened. And yet, something had. Because sometimes, the loudest moments aren't the ones filled with shouting, but the ones where someone is treated like they don't exist at all. And if you've ever felt that kind of silence, that kind of invisibility, maybe this story will stay with you a little longer tonight. And if you're here, wherever you are in the world, at whatever hour this finds you, you're already part of it now. So if your heart leans towards stories where quiet moments matter, you can stay a little longer, maybe even subscribe and turn on the bell, just so you don't miss what happens when silence finally speaks. The kitchen door swung shut behind Ava with a muted thud, sealing off the polished calm of the dining room and replacing it with heat, motion, and the sharp rhythm of orders being called out over clattering pans. Steam curled into the air, carrying the scent of butter and seared steak, but none of it touched the tightness sitting low in her chest. She set the empty tray down on the stainless steel counter, fingers lingering against the cool surface for just a second longer than necessary, grounding herself before the next order came in. Table 12, medium rare, no. Substitutions, the ticket read, printed in stark black ink that did not care about tone or tension or the way someone had just spoken to her like she was less than the space she occupied. "That your table?" one of the line cooks asked, glancing up briefly, his voice casual, unaware. Ava nodded once. "Yeah." He gave a small shrug. "Guy looks like trouble." She almost smiled at that, but it did not quite reach her eyes. Trouble was loud, unpredictable, explosive. What sat at table 12 was something else entirely, something quieter, colder, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to shift a room. She picked up the plates when they were ready, the heat pressing through the ceramic into her palms as she balanced them carefully, her posture straight, her expression composed. But as she pushed back through the doors, something felt different. The air had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the low hum of conversation had dipped just enough to notice. And then she saw why. The boy was no longer looking at his glass. He was looking at her, not in passing, not by accident, but directly, steadily, as if he had been waiting. Ava slowed without meaning to, her steps measured, the world around her softening at the edges as that small, quiet focus pulled her in. It was the kind of look children gave when they were trying to understand something they could not name yet. When she reached the table, she set the plates down with the same careful precision as before, but this time, she felt it, the difference, the slight shift in gravity. "Your steak, sir," she said gently, placing it in front of Richard without expecting acknowledgement. And she did not get one. He was already cutting into it, already moving on, already finished with her presence before she had fully stepped into it. But the boy did not look away. Ava hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for something instinctive to surface. "And for you," she added softly, setting the smaller plate down in front of him, her voice lowering just slightly, almost like a secret. "Careful, it is still hot." It was a simple thing, the kind of sentence she said dozens of times a night, but this time it landed differently, because the boy blinked. Once, slowly, and then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers shifted closer to the edge of the plate, as if the words had reached him somewhere deeper than expected. Richard noticed the movement immediately. His knife paused mid-cut, the faint scrape of metal against porcelain stopping short. He looked up, not at Ava, but at his son, his expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with irritation. "Noah," he said, his voice controlled but sharper now, pulling the moment back into something rigid, something structured. "Eat." The boy did not respond. He kept looking at Ava, and for the first time, Richard followed that line of sight. Not past her, not through her, at her. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was enough to register something he had not accounted for. Not recognition, not respect, but interruption. Ava felt it the second it happened, the way the air seemed to hold, the way something unspoken shifted between all three of them. And then Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze narrowing just enough to signal a boundary being redrawn. "I said we are fine," he added, this time directed at her, his tone quieter but more pointed, as if correcting a mistake she had not yet made. Ava gave a small nod, stepping back as expected. But as she turned, she caught it, just at the edge of her vision. The boy's hand moved again, not toward the food, toward her. It stopped halfway, hovering in the space between intention and action, before slowly retreating back to the table. A small movement, easy to miss, but not insignificant, not after months of silence, and not unnoticed by the man sitting across from him, whose grip on his knife had tightened just enough to leave a faint impression along his knuckles, as if, for the first time that night, something was no longer entirely under his control. The clink of silverware resumed around the room, cautious at first, like the restaurant was testing whether it was safe to breathe again. But at table 12 the silence settled deeper, heavier, pressing into the space between father and son with a weight that did not belong in a place built for comfort. Richard Coleman set his knife down with measured precision, aligning it parallel to the edge of his plate, a small act of control in a moment that had begun to slip beyond it. His gaze shifted back to his son, sharper now, more searching than before, as if recalibrating something he had always assumed he understood. "Noah," he said again, slower this time, each syllable deliberate, "look at me." The boy did not. His eyes followed Ava as she moved away from the table, carrying nothing now, just the quiet presence she had learned to shrink into when needed, but the connection lingered like a thread stretched too tight to snap cleanly. Richard exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that did nothing to ease the tension building under his collar. "This is not appropriate," he added, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to his son or to the situation itself. Across the room, Ava paused near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the edge as she waited for the next signal, the next instruction, but her attention had not fully left the table. She could feel it, that pull again, subtle but persistent, like a quiet knock she could not ignore. And then it happened. It was small, almost nothing, but it was enough. Noah's fingers tapped once against the table. Not random, not restless, intentional. A soft, uneven rhythm that broke the stillness just enough to be heard by the person who was listening for it. Ava turned her head before she realized she had done it. Richard saw it too. The movement, the pattern. His posture stiffened, every line of him tightening as something unfamiliar edged into his expression. Confusion, yes, but beneath it, something closer to disbelief. Noah, he said, quieter now, the authority in his voice thinning into something more uncertain. What are you doing? The boy did not answer. He tapped again, 2 times this time, then stopped. Ava's breath caught slightly, not from surprise, but from recognition. It was not just movement. It was rhythm, a pattern. She had seen it before, in spaces far removed from white tablecloths and polished glass, in moments where words failed and something else had to take their place. She took a step forward without thinking, then stopped herself just as quickly, the invisible line between employee and intrusion flashing bright in her mind. But Richard noticed that too. Not the meaning behind it. Not yet, but the shift in her posture, the almost step, the hesitation. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. If you have something to say, he said, this time directly to her, his tone controlled but edged with something sharper. Say it. It was not an invitation. It was a test, the kind that did not forgive missteps. The air around the table seemed to thin, every nearby sound dulling as if the room itself was leaning in. Ava felt it settle on her shoulders, the weight of being seen and scrutinized at the same time, but she did not look at Richard first. She looked at Noah. The boy's fingers hovered again, just above the table, waiting, uncertain, like he was standing at the edge of something he had not crossed in a long time. Ava lowered her voice when she finally spoke, soft enough that it did not carry beyond the table, but steady enough that it did not waver. He is not tapping randomly, she said. A beat. Richard did not move. It is a pattern. Another pause, longer this time, stretching thin between them. He is trying to communicate. The words landed quietly, but they shifted everything. Richard's gaze snapped back to his son, sharper than before, searching for something he had missed, something he had not been willing to see. Noah's fingers tapped again. Once, then twice, then a pause. Not chaos, not noise. A sequence. And for the first time that night, Richard did not interrupt it. He watched, really watched. And in that stillness, something fragile and unfamiliar began to take shape. Something that did not fit into his controlled world. Something that could not be commanded or corrected. Ava remained where she was, just outside the boundary she was not supposed to cross, her presence quiet but undeniable. And the space between them, once rigid and defined, began to blur in a way none of them had expected. Richard did not speak right away. That alone was enough to shift the air again. The man who had controlled every second of this evening now sat completely still, his eyes fixed on his son's hand, as if the smallest movement might disappear if he blinked. Noah's fingers hovered above the table, then tapped again. Once. Pause. Twice. Longer pause. It was not random. It was not noise. It was intention trying to find a way out. Richard leaned forward slightly, his chair barely making a sound against the floor, his focus narrowing in a way that shut out everything else in the room. What does that mean? He asked, not looking at Ava this time, his voice lower, tighter, pulled from somewhere deeper than authority. Ava stepped closer before she could stop herself, crossing the invisible line she had respected all night. The movement was small, but it changed everything. A nearby server glanced over. The manager, standing near the bar, straightened slightly. Boundaries in places like this were not suggestions. They were rules. Ava felt it immediately, the awareness of eyes, of risk, but she did not retreat. Not this time. She kept her gaze on Noah, her voice soft, careful, like she was stepping onto thin ice. It is not a word yet, she said gently. It is the pattern he recognizes. Maybe something he learned before he stopped speaking. Richard's jaw tightened. He does not learn things like that. He replied quickly, almost too quickly, as if rejecting the possibility before it could take shape. But even as he said it, Noah tapped again. This time faster. Urgent. The rhythm shifted, less measured, more insistent, like frustration building beneath the surface. Ava noticed it instantly. The change in tempo, the slight tremor in his fingers. He is trying harder now, she said, her tone still calm, but edged with something more certain. He needs a response. Richard finally looked at her fully, really looked this time, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. There was resistance there, control, but underneath it, something else was pressing through, something he could not command away. And you know how to respond? He asked. It was not a challenge. Not entirely. It was something closer to a question he did not want to need answered. Ava hesitated, just for a moment. Then, she nodded once. Slowly, she lowered her hand to the table, not touching Noah, not breaking the space he controlled, but placing her fingers lightly against the surface. Then she tapped. Once. Pause. Twice. The same pattern. The boy froze. Completely. The movement stopped midair, his fingers suspended above the table as if the world had just shifted in a way he did not expect. For a second, nothing happened. Then his hand lowered, and he tapped back. Once. Pause. Twice. The exact same rhythm. A perfect echo. The silence around them deepened, no longer empty, but filled with something fragile and electric. Ava's breath slowed. She matched him again. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. The exchange was simple, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but to Richard, it was everything. His hand tightened against the edge of the table, not in anger, but in disbelief. He has not responded to anyone in months, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Not doctors, not specialists, no one. And yet here he was, responding, not with words, but with something that carried meaning all the same. Noah's tapping grew steadier now, more confident, as if the connection had anchored him. Ava followed, her rhythm consistent, grounding, never forcing, never rushing. The world around them seemed to fall away, the clinking glasses, the low conversations, the soft music, all fading into something distant and irrelevant. Until a voice cut through it. Ava. It was sharp, controlled. The manager. He stood a few feet away now, his expression tight, professional, but unmistakably firm. Step away from the table. The moment cracked instantly. Not shattered, but fractured. Ava's hand stilled. Noah's fingers stopped mid-tap. The fragile thread between them stretched thin again, pulled by something external, something cold and structured and unyielding. Ava did not move right away. Just a second. Just enough to feel the weight of the choice in front of her. Job. Or this moment. And for the first time that night, Richard did not speak to dismiss her. He did not reinforce the order. He just watched. Waiting. Not as a man in control, but as a father who had just seen something he could not afford to lose. The manager did not raise his voice, but the firmness in it carried further than any shout could have, cutting clean through the fragile connection that had just begun to form. Ava, step away. Now. His shoes were polished, his posture rigid, every inch of him representing policy, liability, order. The kind of order that did not leave room for moments like this. Ava's hand remained still against the table, her fingers hovering just above the surface where the last rhythm had faded. Noah's eyes were locked on her, wide now, alert in a way that had not been there before, as if something inside him had just woken up and did not understand why it was being asked to go back to sleep. Richard's gaze moved between them, sharper, more conflicted, the edges of his control beginning to fracture in ways he could not hide anymore. She is helping, he said, the words coming out lower than expected, almost restrained, like he was testing them before fully committing. The manager did not hesitate. She is crossing boundaries, he replied, just as controlled. We have protocols. If your son needs assistance, we can call someone qualified. Qualified. The word hung in the air like a quiet dismissal of everything that had just happened. Ava felt it land, not as an insult, but as a reminder of her place. Her uniform. Her role. The invisible line she had already stepped over. She slowly withdrew her hand from the table, the movement careful, deliberate, like pulling back from something fragile that might break if handled too quickly. And immediately, Noah's fingers twitched. Not tapping. Not yet. Just a small, uncertain motion, like the absence of the pattern had created a gap he did not know how to fill. Richard saw it. His jaw tightened again, but this time it was not about control. It was about loss. Immediate. Visible. Wait, he said suddenly. The word came out sharper than intended, cutting across the manager's next step forward. The room seemed to pause again, not entirely silent, but aware, watching without looking. The manager stopped, his expression shifting slightly, not surprised, but recalculating. "Sir," he began, his tone still professional, but now edged with caution, "we cannot allow." I said, "Wait." Richard did not raise his voice, but the authority returned in a different form now, not cold, not dismissive, but anchored in something more urgent, something personal. The manager held his position, tension settling into the space between them like a line drawn in air. Ava stood still, caught in the middle of it, her hands now at her sides, her posture neutral, but her attention still anchored to the boy. Noah's fingers lifted again, hesitated, then tapped. Once, softer this time, less certain. The rhythm was breaking. Ava felt it immediately, like a signal fading. She looked at Richard, just briefly, not for permission, but for acknowledgement. For a second, he did not respond. Then something shifted in his expression. Not approval, not fully, but not rejection either. It was enough. Ava stepped forward again, slower this time, more cautious, aware that every movement now carried weight. She lowered her hand once more to the table, her fingers barely touching the surface, and tapped back. Once. Pause. Twice. The pattern returned, fragile but present. Noah's shoulders eased, just slightly, his hand responding again, more steady this time, as if the thread had been caught before it could slip away completely. The manager exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in recognition that the situation was no longer simple. This was no longer about a server overstepping. Something else was happening here. Something harder to define, harder to stop without consequence. He stepped back half a pace, not conceding, but not interrupting either. A temporary retreat, a watchful pause, and in that narrow space of allowance, the rhythm continued. Soft, repeating, building something that did not belong to policy or protocol, but to something far more human. Richard leaned forward again, his eyes fixed on his son, but this time there was no command in his posture. Only attention. Real, unfiltered attention. "Noah," he said quietly, almost carefully, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever this was. The boy did not look at him. Not yet. But his tapping did not stop. And for the first time in months, that was more than silence. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. And neither of them knew how far it might go. The rhythm steadied again, but it was no longer fragile in the same way. It carried a pulse now, something intentional, something that refused to fade back into silence. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. Ava matched it, her fingers light, precise, never rushing ahead, never forcing the moment to become more than what Noah was ready to give. Around them, the restaurant continued in motion, but the energy had shifted. Conversations lowered without people realizing why. Glasses were lifted more carefully. Even the music seemed to recede, like the room itself understood that something quieter and far more important had taken center stage. Richard remained leaning forward, his elbows near the edge of the table, his posture no longer composed but engaged, almost fragile in its focus. He watched every movement of his son's hand, every pause, every return. "Noah," he tried again, softer this time, his voice stripped of command, stripped of expectation. The boy's tapping slowed. Not stopping, just changing. The pattern broke, then reformed into something new. One tap. Pause. One tap. Longer pause. Ava's brow softened slightly as she observed it, her head tilting just enough to signal that she was listening in a different way now. "He is adjusting," she murmured, more to herself than to Richard. "It is not the same pattern anymore." Richard's breath caught almost imperceptibly. "What does that mean?" he asked, quieter than before, the question no longer guarded, no longer defensive. Ava did not answer immediately. She watched Noah's hand, the slight hesitation between movements, the way his fingers curled just before tapping, as if each motion had to pass through something unseen before it could reach the surface. Then she responded, her voice calm but certain. "It means he is not just repeating," she said. "He is choosing." The words settled heavily. Choosing. Not reacting. Not echoing. Initiating. Richard leaned back slightly, just enough for the weight of that idea to land fully. For months, everything about his son had been described in terms of absence. What he did not do, what he could not access, what he had lost. But this was different. This was presence. Small, quiet, but undeniable. Noah tapped again. 2 quick taps. Pause. 1. Ava did not mirror it this time. Instead, she waited. The pause stretched longer than before, the air tightening again, but this time it was not uncertainty. It was space. Intentional space. Noah's fingers hovered, then tapped again. The same pattern. He repeated it. Slower. Clearer. Ava nodded slightly, a soft recognition passing across her face. Then she tapped back. Not the same pattern. A different one. 1 tap. Pause. 2 taps. It was subtle, almost indistinguishable to anyone else. But to Noah, it was a shift. His head lifted slightly, his eyes focusing more sharply, his breathing changing in a way that signaled something internal had clicked. He responded immediately, matching her new pattern. Perfectly. Richard's hand tightened against the table again, but this time it was not disbelief. It was something closer to awe. He is following you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava shook her head gently. No, she corrected softly. He is meeting me. The distinction was small, but it carried weight. This was not obedience. It was connection. And then, without warning, Noah's hand stopped. Completely. The silence that followed was different from before. Not empty, not distant, but full, charged. His fingers curled slowly into his palm, his shoulders drawing in just slightly, as if something deeper was surfacing beneath the rhythm. Ava did not move. She did not reach out. She did not speak. She waited. The seconds stretched. Richard leaned forward again, his breath shallow now, his focus absolute. Noah, he said quietly. And then it happened. Not a word. Not yet. But something just as powerful. Noah lifted his other hand. Slowly, uncertainly, and placed it flat against the table, closer to Ava's hand than before. Not touching, but close enough that the space between them felt intentional. Chosen. Ava's eyes softened, something deep and unspoken moving through her expression, but she still did not close the distance. She let him hold it. That space. That decision. And in that quiet, deliberate movement, the rhythm had transformed into something else entirely. Not just communication, but trust. And for the first time since the moment began, Richard did not look at Ava for answers. He looked at his son, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in a very long while. Noah's hand remained there, hovering in that small, deliberate space between himself and Ava, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin without ever crossing into touch. The distance was less than an inch, but it carried the weight of something far greater than proximity. Ava did not move. She did not close it. She understood instinctively that this space belonged to him, that whatever came next had to come from his side of it. The restaurant seemed to lean inward again, not with curiosity now, but with a quiet reverence, as if even the clatter of dishes and low murmur of voices had learned to stay out of the way of something unfolding that could not be rushed. Richard's breathing had changed. Slower, shallower. His eyes tracked every fraction of movement, every subtle shift in his son's posture, searching for something familiar and finding something entirely new instead. Noah, he said again, but this time the name carried no instruction, no expectation, just presence. The boy's fingers twitched once, then stilled. His gaze lifted, not fully, not all the way to Ava's face, but higher than before, breaking the pattern of avoidance that had defined him for months. It was not eye contact, not yet, but it was movement in that direction. Ava's voice, when it came, was softer than it had been all night, barely above a breath. You can take your time, she said, not to guide him, but to give him permission. The words settled gently, like something placed rather than spoken. And then, for a moment, everything held. Until it did not. The manager stepped forward again. Not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a decision that had finally solidified. This has gone far enough, he said, his tone still controlled, but no longer negotiable. Ava, step away from the table immediately. The words landed harder this time because they came with consequence. There was no pause behind them. No space. The boundary was being enforced now. Ava felt it instantly, the shift from watchful allowance to firm correction. Around them, a few heads turned more openly now, the illusion of privacy thinning under the pressure of attention. The moment was no longer contained. It was exposed. Noah's hand recoiled slightly at the change in tone, not pulling back entirely, but retreating just enough to signal that something external had disrupted the fragile equilibrium. Ava's chest tightened. She had known this was coming. Moments like this did not belong in places like this for long. She slowly straightened, her hand lifting from the table, her fingers curling inward as she pulled back, respecting the command even as something in her resisted it. But before she could take a full step away, Richard spoke. No, it was quiet, but it carried. The manager stopped again, his expression shifting from authority to something more measured, more cautious. Sir, we cannot. No, Richard repeated, this time looking directly at him, his voice still calm, but now anchored in something that did not bend easily. You cannot interrupt this. The words hung in the air, not loud, not forceful, but immovable. The manager hesitated, caught between policy and the unmistakable weight of the man in front of him. Ava froze mid-step, her body caught between leaving and staying, the decision no longer hers alone. And Noah reacted. His hand moved forward again, not hesitantly this time, not halfway, fully. He closed the distance himself, placing his small hand directly over the spot where Ava's fingers had just been. Then, slowly, carefully, he turned his palm upward. An offering. Simple, clear, intentional. Ava's breath caught softly. She looked at Richard, just for a second, not asking, acknowledging. And this time, he did not look away. He did not dismiss her. He did not correct the moment. He gave the smallest nod. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Ava lowered her hand again, slower than before, more aware now than ever of the weight of what she was about to do. And when her fingers finally met his, lightly, gently, without pressure, Noah did not pull away. He held it, not tightly, not urgently, but with a steadiness that had not been there before. The room did not erupt. There was no dramatic shift in sound or movement. But something changed in a way that could not be undone. Because this was not just connection anymore. This was choice. And for the first time in months, Noah had made one that reached beyond himself. Richard exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding for far longer than he realized, his shoulders lowering just slightly as something inside him gave way, not in defeat, but in recognition. And the man who had once ignored her now sat completely still, watching as the one person he could not reach finally reached someone else. Noah did not let go. His small fingers remained wrapped lightly around Ava's hand, not gripping, not clinging, but holding with a quiet certainty that made the gesture feel larger than it was. Ava kept her hand steady, her touch gentle, responsive, never leading, never pulling. She followed his pace, his pressure, his rhythm, allowing the moment to belong entirely to him. The warmth between their hands seemed to anchor something deeper, something that had been drifting without direction for far too long. Richard watched it all without interruption, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders no longer squared in control. There was something unguarded in his expression now, something unfamiliar even to himself. Not confusion, not disbelief, recognition, not of Ava, but of his son, the version of him that had been there before everything went quiet. Noah, he said again, softer than ever, the name no longer a call, but a presence offered. The boy's head tilted slightly, just enough to register the sound, but his eyes remained fixed somewhere between Ava's hand and the space just beyond it. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his lips parted. The movement was so small it could have been missed entirely if anyone had looked away for even a second. But Ava saw it. Richard saw it. Even the manager, still standing just a few feet away, felt the shift in the air as something fragile began to take shape again. Noah inhaled, a shallow breath that trembled just slightly, as if his body was remembering something it had forgotten how to do. His fingers tightened around Ava's for a brief moment, not in fear, but in effort. And then a sound came. Not a word, not fully formed, but unmistakable, a soft, broken syllable that carried more weight than any sentence. M. The sound barely reached beyond the table, but it landed like something seismic. Ava's eyes softened immediately, her expression steady, not reacting with surprise, not overwhelming the moment, but receiving it with the same calm presence she had held all along. It is okay, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. You are doing it. Richard's breath caught in his chest, sharp and sudden, as if the air had been pulled out of him and returned all at once. His hand moved slightly on the table, fingers pressing into the surface as he leaned forward, unable to stop himself now. Noah, he repeated, but this time the name broke at the edges, carrying something raw beneath it. The boy's lips moved again. Another attempt. The sound came out uneven, uncertain, but stronger than before. Ma. Ava did not speak this time. She simply stayed, present, steady, allowing the moment to unfold without pushing it forward. And then the realization hit Richard with a force that did not need volume. It was not random. It was not accidental. It was not just sound. His son was not just speaking. He was reaching for something. For someone. Memory flickered across Richard's face, sharp and immediate. A woman's voice. A softer presence. The way Noah used to say that word before everything changed. Before silence took its place. He is not trying to say anything new, Ava said gently, her voice low, careful not to disturb the fragile thread forming between past and present. He is remembering. The word settled deeply. Remembering. Not learning. Not being taught. Returning. Richard's vision blurred for just a second, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding something he had not allowed himself to face. This was not just progress. This was grief moving. This was connection breaking through loss. Noah's hand tightened again, his fingers curling more firmly around Ava's, grounding himself in the moment as he tried once more. His voice came out clearer this time, still soft, still fragile, but undeniable. Mom. The word lingered in the air, trembling, unfinished in its full strength, but complete in its meaning. Ava did not correct him. She did not pull away. She simply held his hand, her presence absorbing the moment without claiming it. Because this was not about her. It never had been. Richard closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, as the sound reached something deep inside him that had been locked away behind control and routine and distance. When he opened them again, he was no longer looking at Ava as a stranger in a uniform. He was looking at her as the person who had just helped his son find his way back to a word he thought was gone forever. And for the first time that night, the power in the room had shifted completely. Not through force, not through status, but through something far quieter, something far stronger. The word did not echo. It did not need to. It settled into the space between them like something that had always belonged there, quiet and undeniable. Noah's fingers loosened slightly in Ava's hand, not letting go, but no longer holding with effort. The tension that had once lived in his shoulders eased, replaced by something softer, something steadier, as if the act of reaching had finally given him somewhere to rest. Ava did not move her hand away. She did not tighten her grip either. She simply stayed, her presence unchanged, allowing the moment to breathe on its own without adding anything that might weigh it down. Richard sat very still. The kind of stillness that does not come from control, but from understanding something too important to interrupt. His gaze remained on his son, but it had changed. The sharpness was gone. The constant evaluation, the need to fix, to correct, to manage, had faded into something quieter. He was not searching for what was wrong anymore. He was seeing what was there. His hand, which had been pressed against the table, slowly relaxed. The tension left his fingers one by one, like something uncoiling after being held too tightly for too long. Noah, he said. Again, but this time it was not a question, not a call, not even an attempt. It was simply his son's name, spoken as if it had always been enough. The boy's head tilted just slightly toward the sound, not fully turning, not fully responding, but no longer retreating from it either. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was real. Ava gently withdrew her hand after a moment, not abruptly, not as a loss, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the connection no longer needed to be held in place. Noah's fingers remained where hers had been, resting against the table, but they did not reach out again. They did not need to. The space between them had already done its work. The manager stood a few feet away, no longer intervening, no longer calculating. His posture had softened, just slightly, as if even he understood that whatever rule had been broken here had given way to something that did not fit inside rules at all. Ava stepped back, her hands returning to her sides, her expression calm, unchanged, as if she had simply done her job. But something lingered in the way she looked at Noah, not as someone who had fixed anything, but as someone who had recognized something and made space for it to return. Richard finally looked at her. Fully. Not past her. Not through her. At her. There was no performance in his expression, no rehearsed gratitude, no grand gesture waiting to follow. Just a quiet shift in understanding. Thank you, he said, the words simple, unadorned, but carried with a weight that made them feel earned rather than offered. Ava gave a small nod, nothing more, as if the moment did not belong to thanks or recognition, but to what had already happened. She turned then, moving back toward the soft rhythm of the restaurant, disappearing into it the same way she always had. But this time, something had changed. Not in the room, not in the lights or the music or the quiet conversations that resumed around them, but in the way one man sat at a table, no longer trying to control silence, but finally willing to listen to it. And in the way a small boy rested his hand on a place that no longer felt empty. The plates remained on the table, the food untouched for a moment longer, the air still carrying the warmth of what had just passed. Richard picked up his glass slowly, then paused, his eyes drifting once more to the space where Ava had stood. Not with regret, not with obligation, but with recognition of something he had missed, and something he would not ignore again. And if this quiet moment stayed with you, the way it lingers in small gestures and unspoken words, you can stay with stories like this. Follow along. Turn on the bell so you do not miss the next one. And maybe share where you are watching from. Because sometimes the most important things we hear are the ones that are barely spoken at all.